Most people hear the word audit and think of taxes. But in cybersecurity, an audit is how you find out whether an organization is actually doing what it claims to be doing. And the gap between what's claimed and what's real is often where breaches happen. I'm currently in information assurance and compliance, and week 1 just wrapped up. And this course is probably the most directly career relevant thing I've taken in this entire program for anyone trying to get into GRC. Here's what week 1 actually covered. Now, for quick context on the course before we jump into the meat and potatoes, information assurance and compliance runs 4 weeks. Now, week 1 is about audit foundations and risk assessment. Week 2 is audit planning. Week 3 is actually conducting the audit, including a PCI DSS audit using a document called the SAQD, which I'll get into when we hit that week. And week 4 is writing the audit report. Now, every week builds on the last. And by the end of the month, you've successfully walked into an entire audit lifecycle from scratch. Now, that's the structure that we'll be using. So let's talk about what week 1 actually taught me. Now, what is a security audit, right? So week 1, with the information that I have learned, has the most foundational questions, such as what is an audit and why does it exist? In information security, an audit is a structured review of an organization's controls, its policies, and practices to determine whether they're effective, whether they're being followed, and whether they're compliant with whatever standard or regulations apply to that organization. The key word here is structured. An audit isn't someone just poking around and forming opinions. It's defined. It has a defined scope, it has clear criteria, and it produces a documented result that organizations can actually act on. Now, to answer the why, and here's a thing that actually reframed how I think about an audit. So an audit exists because organizations can't be trusted to accurately self-assess. Not because they're dishonest, but because every organization has blind spots, competing priorities, and incentives to downplay problems. An independent audit is how you get an honest picture. So there are various types of auditors, and we covered 3 of those auditors in this first week. So we covered the internal auditors, and they are employees of an organization. They know the environment deeply, but they're limited by the fact that they report to the same leadership they're evaluating. Therefore, there is an inherent conflict there. Then we have our external auditors, which are independent third parties, like consulting firms or specialized audit companies. Now, they bring objectivity and often bring deep framework expertise, but they're working from documentation and interviews rather than deep organizational knowledge. Regulators are the third types of auditors that we covered, and they're government or industry bodies with legal authority. Think PCI DSS, HIPAA, and SOX. Now, these all have regulatory bodies that can mandate audits and impose consequences for non-compliance. This type of audit isn't optional. This is the kind of audit that if you've failed as an organization, there are real legal and financial consequences. Now, the second major topic in week one was risk assessment, and this is where the course got genuinely interesting for me. Because before you can audit anything, you need to understand what's at risk. A risk assessment is the process of identifying an organization's assets, identifying the threats and vulnerabilities that apply to those assets, and estimating the potential impact if something does go wrong. Now, the course introduced something called risk scoring, which is basically a way of prioritizing your risks. So, essentially, you can't fix everything at once, but with risk scoring, it gives you a rational basis for deciding what to address first. The basic formula is likelihood multiplied by impact, and that gives you your risk score. So high likelihood, high impact, and that will be your top priority. Low likelihood, low impact, and that essentially goes on like a backlog. So the lab that we did this week applied this to a fictitious company where we identified their assets, we map their threats to those assets, and we produce a risk register. Now, the risk register basically is just documenting the list of identified risks with their scores and any proposed mitigation plans that we would recommend. Now, it sounds simple, but building one from scratch, it clarifies your thinking really fast. And lastly, the third piece of week one was preparing for an audit. What actually happens before an auditor walks in the door? There are a few things that consistently came up in the audit prep. First was document collection. Auditors are going to ask for your policies and your procedures, your system configurations, your access logs. And if you can produce those quickly and cleanly, that's already a finding for the audit. Now, second, it was personnel, who gets interviewed. The audit team needs to identify which staff members have relevant knowledge, such as security leads, IT managers, HR for access control processes. And so the interviews are important as the documents are. And also, there's just one thing that I didn't really expect to matter in this entire batch of information, and it's how does an organization communicate with the audit team? This is so important because how are your findings escalated? Who has authority to respond to those findings? Now, audits that go badly often go badly not because the findings were severe, but because no one knows who's supposed to respond. Now, what did I actually struggle with this week? To be honest, week one felt conceptually dense at the start. There were a lot of frameworks, a lot of terminology, and it's easy to feel like you're memorizing definitions without actually understanding how they connect. But what helped me anchor everything was the audit lifecycle. Every concept that we covered, risk scoring, auditor types, document collection, it's a piece of one big process. Now, once I could see where each piece sat on the larger scale, it actually stopped me from feeling like I was just going through an isolated vocabulary and started making structural sense of everything. So if you're studying for CISA or you're working towards GRC and you're hitting that same wall where you're unsure of, what's making sense, then that's the reframe that worked for me. So in all, week one, the foundational aspect of it is extremely essential. If you skipped any part of week one, I really feel like you'd spend the rest of the course confused about why you're doing what you're doing. The risk assessment lab was the most valuable part, in my opinion, not because of the fictitious company scenario being realistic, but because actually building a risk register by hand teaches you what goes into a risk assessment in a way that reading about it does not. is this relevant for GRC? It's extremely relevant. Risk assessments and audit preparation are two of the most consistent responsibilities in a GRC job description. It's not just abstract. This is going to be the job 100%. So that's really it covering for week 1. Week 2, as I explained, will be on planning an audit, defining a scope and so forth. I will be posting that video also, so please stay tuned. And then I'll be dropping week 3 as well in the same succession, talking about, the PCI live audit and so forth. I'm Cybermaker, and this is Camel Code Academy. Subscribe if you want to follow in real time, and I'll see you in the next video.